August 22nd, 2021. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden hue over the peaceful suburban streets of Oakwood Hills. It was the kind of evening that seemed straight out of a storybook, quiet, serene, untouched by the chaos of the world. But on Maple Drive, one house was about to shatter the tranquility. The Mitchell family, known for their success and picture-perfect life, would soon be at the center of a nightmare no one saw coming. From the outside, their home appeared no different from any other on the street. The manicured lawn, the inviting porch, the window boxes brimming with flowers, everything screamed normal. But inside that seemingly ordinary house, a deadly secret had been brewing. A secret that would destroy a family and change Oakwood Hills forever. It was just after dinner when the first calls came in. A neighbor hearing strange noises coming from the Mitchell house, followed by the sound of an engine revving in the dead of night. The police were dispatched, unaware that they were about to uncover a crime that would leave a mark on the town for years to come. When officers arrived, the house was eerily quiet. No signs of forced entry, no broken windows, just an unsettling stillness that permeated the air. But when they entered, they were met with a chilling scene. The body of Sarah Mitchell, the beloved wife and mother, lying lifeless on the living room floor. The scene was stark, the details haunting. But what sent shockwaves through the investigation was the realization that Sarah's death wasn't a random act of violence. This was personal. Someone she knew, someone she trusted, had ended her life. The question on everyone's mind: who could do such a thing, and why? As the authorities began their search for answers, they had no idea just how tangled the truth would be. What appeared to be a tragic death in a quiet neighborhood was, in reality, the beginning of a twisted tale of betrayal, passion, and cold revenge. And the dark secrets lurking within the Mitchell family would soon come to light, shaking Oakwood Hills to its core. Sarah Mitchell had everything that most women in Oakwood Hills would envy. She was the epitome of suburban perfection. Devoted wife, loving mother, and successful businesswoman. She ran a popular interior design firm, had 2 beautiful children, and a picture-perfect home on Maple Drive. To anyone on the outside, Sarah had it all. She was a woman whose life seemed straight out of a magazine, filled with every material blessing one could desire. But for Sarah, the outward perfection masked a growing sense of emptiness, a feeling that everything in her life had been carefully curated to look flawless. But something essential was missing. As she sipped her morning coffee, the quiet hum of her suburban home almost felt stifling. The routine, once comforting, had become a trap. Her children, Emily and Jake, were at school, and Mark, her husband of 10 years, was already at work, engrossed in his law practice. Sarah often wondered what it would be like to feel truly alive again, to feel something real, not just the careful construction of a life that was supposed to be perfect. Every evening, Mark would come home late from the office, tired and distant. He'd offer a tired smile and a quick kiss on the cheek, but that was all. The intimacy between them had long since faded. Their conversations were reduced to logistics. Who was picking up the kids? What time was dinner? What day was the next client meeting? Sarah wanted more. She wanted to feel seen. That was when she met Alex Mitchell, Mark's younger brother. Mark Mitchell, by all accounts, was a successful man. He had worked hard for everything he had: the house, the cars, the stable family life. He was a lawyer, respected in the community, known for his professionalism and dedication. But in his pursuit of success, he had slowly neglected the very things he had worked so hard to build. Mark was the kind of man who was always buried in his work, spending long hours at the office or on conference calls. He was driven, almost to a fault. For him, life was about maintaining the perfect facade, a perfect home, a perfect career, a perfect family. But somewhere along the way, he lost sight of his wife, the woman he once promised to cherish. He noticed the subtle changes in Sarah, her quiet sighs, the way her eyes would wander as she spoke to him. But Mark was too consumed with his career to confront these feelings. After all, he had provided for her, for their family. What more could she want? Wasn't that enough? But it wasn't. Sarah didn't want more things. She wanted the man she married, the man who had once made her feel special, seen. But that man was buried beneath the endless piles of paperwork, legal briefs, and client meetings. Mark's obsession with success had started to feel like a cage that kept Sarah locked inside, suffocating, unable to breathe. Alex Mitchell, Mark's younger brother, was the complete opposite of his older sibling. Charismatic, carefree, and full of life, Alex had always lived in the moment. He was the type of person who could walk into a room and immediately command attention. He had a magnetic personality, a kind of energy that drew people in. He never worried about the things that burdened his older brother: commitments, responsibilities, and the relentless pursuit of success. Alex had lived a transient life, moving from place to place, never staying in one place too long. He had always been a bit of a free spirit, someone who would do what he wanted when he wanted, without concern for consequences. But when Alex returned to Oakwood Hills, after several years of traveling and living abroad, things would never be the same. He wasn't home for long before he and Sarah crossed paths. Initially, it was innocent enough, a casual conversation at a family gathering. But there was something about Alex, something that stirred a part of Sarah she had long forgotten. His easy smile, his laugh, his effortless charm. It was like a spark in her life that had been missing for years. Sarah felt a jolt of excitement when he was around, something that hadn't existed in her life for a long time. Over the following weeks, their interactions grew more frequent. Casual talks turned into private conversations. What had started as friendly banter soon shifted into something deeper, more intense. Sarah couldn't quite put her finger on it, but something about Alex made her feel alive again, something she hadn't felt in years. The more time she spent with him, the more she realized just how hollow her marriage had become. She hadn't planned it. Of course not. It was never supposed to be this way. But one thing led to another, and before Sarah knew it, she had crossed a line she could never return from. For Alex, this was just another adventure. He wasn't looking for anything serious. He didn't think about the consequences. For him, life was a series of fleeting moments, and this one was just another chapter in his carefree existence. But for Sarah, it was something else entirely, a desperate attempt to fill the void, to find something real and passionate, something that would make her feel desired again. As Sarah's secret affair with Alex grew, so did the cracks in the perfect life she had once built. What she didn't know was that this betrayal, this choice, would set off a chain of events that none of them could have predicted. Her affair with Alex would not only threaten her marriage, but it would also shatter everything she thought she knew about herself, about her family, and about the people closest to her. The Mitchell family was about to be torn apart, and no one was prepared for what was to come. At first, their interactions were innocent. Sarah and Alex's conversations were just the kind of casual chats one might expect between two family members who hadn't seen each other in a while. They talked about life, about the things they both enjoyed, music, travel, and the dreams they once had when they were younger. But in the quiet moments between words, there was an undeniable energy that neither Sarah nor Alex could ignore. It started with small gestures, a lingering smile, a hand brushing lightly against hers as they passed the dinner table. There was a spark, something subtle, almost imperceptible at first. It was the kind of chemistry that made Sarah feel awake in a way she hadn't felt in years. The loneliness that had crept into her marriage seemed to vanish whenever Alex was near. The first real moment of temptation came late one evening. Sarah and Alex found themselves alone at the family home after Mark had gone to bed, and the conversation shifted. It was about nothing in particular, just a light-hearted exchange about their past, about how different their lives had turned out. But then, out of nowhere, Alex's eyes met hers in a way that felt more intimate than anything they'd shared before. The distance between them, once comfortably polite, suddenly felt charged with something else. It wasn't a calculated decision. It wasn't planned. But before either of them could second-guess it, they found themselves leaning in, the pull between them undeniable. Their kiss was soft, tentative at first, but it quickly grew more urgent, as though they were both desperate for something they couldn't explain. Once it happened, there was no going back. What had started as innocent companionship had turned into a dangerous, exhilarating secret. From that night forward, Sarah and Alex's relationship deepened. What had begun as fleeting moments of connection, just conversations and shared laughter, became clandestine meetings. They found time for each other in stolen moments, in the hours when Mark was working late or out of town. They would text each other in the quiet of the night, exchanging messages that grew more flirtatious with each passing day. They started meeting in hidden corners, places where no one would suspect, as the boundaries between their friendship and something more blurred beyond recognition. It wasn't just about physical attraction. For Sarah, it was about feeling alive again. In Alex, she found someone who truly listened, someone who made her feel valued, desired, and seen in a way that Mark hadn't for years. She had begun to look forward to their secret meetings with a mix of anticipation and fear. Fear that one day someone would find out. But for now, the thrill of it was enough to keep her going. Alex, for his part, didn't take things too seriously. He enjoyed the attention, the passion, and the escape Sarah provided from his own uncertain and transient life. He didn't consider the potential consequences of his actions, nor did he truly think about what it would mean for the Mitchell family. For him, this was just another exciting chapter in the story of his life. A brief affair, nothing more. But that wasn't true for Sarah. The deeper she fell into the affair, the more she started to realize just how much she was risking. She loved her family. She loved her children. But Alex made her feel like she was more than just a mother, more than just a wife. She was a woman again, in all her complexity. Meanwhile, Mark began to notice the changes in his wife's behavior. At first, the differences were subtle. Sarah's mood seemed off, more distant at times, almost like she was lost in thought. She started working longer hours, volunteering for projects that kept her away from home. She smiled less, laughed less, and there was a certain guardedness to her, as if she were hiding something, though Mark couldn't quite put his finger on it. At first, he brushed it off. She had always been busy with work, always had a lot on her plate. But soon, the small signs began to add up. Mark started to notice the little things that weren't quite right. Sarah's phone, which she once left carelessly lying around, was now always on silent, always tucked away in her bag when he walked into the room. There were nights when she'd seem unusually preoccupied, staring off into space while they ate dinner, her mind seemingly somewhere else. Then there were the late nights when Sarah would suddenly need to stay at the office for just a few more hours, or claim she had a meeting with clients that ran longer than expected. He didn't understand why she wasn't being upfront with him. The doubts started to gnaw at him. It was the small things that didn't add up, the change in her demeanor, the unexplained trips. And then there was that one moment, one too many to ignore. Sarah had been talking to someone on her phone, laughing, the kind of laugh that made Mark feel like an outsider in his own home. When she saw him walk in, she quickly ended the call, almost too quickly. And for the briefest second, there was an odd look on her face, a mixture of guilt and something else, something he couldn't decipher. Mark felt a chill run through him. The feeling of something being off had only deepened. He couldn't shake the sense that there was more going on than Sarah was willing to admit. But the evidence was still elusive, just fragments of a larger puzzle that he couldn't yet solve. The suspicion was there, growing, but still not enough to confront her. Not yet. The tension that had been building for weeks finally reached a breaking point. Mark couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong. The small signs, Sarah's increasing distance, her late nights, her secrecy, had become too much to ignore. He had tried to brush it off, tried to convince himself that it was all in his head. But deep down, he knew something was happening, something he couldn't control. In his desperation, Mark did what any man in his position might do. He hired a private investigator. The decision was not an easy one. Mark knew that if the investigator uncovered the truth, there would be no turning back. But he had to know. The idea of living in uncertainty, of never knowing what Sarah was hiding, was unbearable. The investigator, a seasoned professional named Derek Williams, assured him that he'd find the answers, no matter how painful they might be. It didn't take long for Derek to gather the evidence Mark had been dreading. Mark's phone rang one afternoon, the call cutting through the silence of his office. It was Derek, and his voice was steady, but grim. "I have everything you asked for," Derek said, his tone carefully neutral. "You should come by and pick it up." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He had been expecting this moment, but now that it was here, he found himself frozen. The truth was within his grasp, and yet part of him wished he could turn away, wished he could ignore the evidence and return to the oblivion of not knowing. But it was too late. The meeting was brief. Derek handed Mark a manila folder, thick with documents. No words were exchanged. The weight of the folder seemed to carry more than just paper. It held the end of Mark's world as he knew it. As soon as Mark returned to his car, he opened the folder. His hands were shaking, but he forced himself to look. Inside, he found photographs. Sarah and Alex, caught in intimate moments. There were pictures of them leaving a restaurant together, laughing, their body language too close, too familiar. There were text messages, too. Messages that were no longer innocent, no longer friendly. The words were full of longing, of passion, of something deep that Mark could never have imagined. His heart sank, as he read the messages, his stomach twisting in disbelief. Mark's mind raced, each piece of evidence feeling like a slap to the face. It was all there, the proof that his wife, the woman he had trusted, had betrayed him. She had been lying to him, hiding her affair with his own brother, someone he had always trusted and loved. The reality of it felt surreal, like a bad dream that he couldn't wake up from. The anger came next, a fire that burned inside him. He wasn't just angry with Sarah. He was furious with Alex, the brother who had known his deepest secrets and shared his life, only to destroy it all with one selfish act. But even more than the anger, there was a deep sense of betrayal. The woman he had devoted his life to had chosen someone else over him, and worse, that someone was his own flesh and blood. With the evidence in hand, Mark knew what he had to do. There was no turning back now. The confrontation was inevitable. He couldn't keep living in the shadow of doubt. He had to face Sarah. He had to make her admit what she had done, to see the truth in her eyes. That evening, after a long day, Mark walked into the house, holding the folder in his hands like a weapon. He found Sarah in the kitchen, her back turned as she prepared dinner. The sight of her, so familiar, so ordinary, only fueled the storm of emotions inside him. "Sarah," he said, his voice steady but cold. She turned, a smile on her face, but it faltered as she saw the look in his eyes. The smile disappeared entirely when she saw the folder in his hands. "What is that?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Mark didn't answer. He opened the folder, letting the photographs fall onto the counter between them. The silence that followed was suffocating. Sarah's face went pale as she saw the evidence laid out before her. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Mark's heart was pounding in his chest as he looked at her, waiting for an explanation, waiting for something that would make sense of the betrayal that had shattered his world. "Is this what you wanted?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Is this why you've been lying to me? Why you've been sneaking around behind my back?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak. She couldn't. There was nothing she could say that would take away the devastation in Mark's eyes. In that moment, everything she had tried to hide, every secret she had hoped to keep buried, was exposed, and she knew there was no going back from it. Mark waited for her to explain, but the silence between them stretched on, thick with guilt and fear. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice barely audible. "Mark, I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I never meant for it to happen. It just did." The words felt hollow, meaningless. Mark could see the remorse in her eyes, but it wasn't enough. The damage had already been done. The betrayal, the deception, it was all laid bare before him. And in that moment, everything he had built with Sarah, everything he had believed in, came crashing down. The truth had shattered Mark's world. Betrayed by the woman he had loved for a decade, and by his own brother, the one person he had always trusted, Mark was consumed by a cold, unrelenting fury. The anger that had initially flared inside him now simmered beneath the surface, a calm and calculating rage that was more dangerous than any outburst. This wasn't just about infidelity anymore. It was about power, control, and retribution. Mark wasn't the kind of man to act in the heat of the moment. He was methodical, precise. His thoughts weren't clouded by grief or irrational emotion. No, Mark had one singular goal: revenge, and it would be ruthless. As he sat in the dim light of his study that night, the folder of photographs and text messages still spread across his desk. Mark's mind went to work. The wheels of his plan began to turn, slow and deliberate, as he weighed his options. Killing Sarah, in his mind, was no longer enough. He wanted to hurt her in the most profound way possible. He wanted to destroy everything she had taken from him, and that meant taking her life in a way that would hurt her even after she was gone. But it wasn't just Sarah who had betrayed him. It was Alex, and Mark was determined that by the end of this, it would be Alex who paid the ultimate price. Mark's plan began to take shape, step by calculated step. He wasn't going to kill Alex outright. No, that would be too simple, too messy. Instead, Mark would make Alex the perfect scapegoat. He would orchestrate every detail so that Alex, his brother, would take the fall for a crime he didn't commit. Mark knew that if he could manipulate the situation carefully enough, there would be no way for anyone to suspect him. He started with the alibis. He knew Sarah's routine, the places she would go, and the people she would see. Mark carefully arranged things so that Alex would be in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was all about timing, knowing when and where to strike. Mark began making subtle moves, dropping hints that would later come back to haunt Alex. He planted a bottle of sleeping pills in Alex's room, knowing full well that it would raise suspicion. It wasn't the pills that mattered. It was the implication. He needed the police to find something that would tie Alex to the murder, something they could use to make him look guilty, even if there was no direct evidence linking him to the crime. Next, Mark moved on to the murder itself. He knew how he wanted it to unfold. Calm, controlled, and methodical. He would wait for the right moment, the moment when Sarah's death would be inevitable. There could be no room for mistakes. He spent days rehearsing the steps in his mind, going over each move. Mark knew exactly what he needed to do. It was all about making sure that when Sarah was gone, Alex would be the first person they looked at. Every detail of his plan was crafted with precision. Mark didn't rush. He was patient, watching and waiting for the right time. The rage that had once threatened to consume him was now a steady, unshakable force, guiding him toward his goal. He would have his revenge, and nothing would stand in his way. As the days passed, Mark's behavior began to change. He became colder, more distant. He kept his emotions hidden behind a mask of calm, careful control. He no longer had the energy for petty arguments or emotional outbursts. Instead, his mind was focused entirely on the execution of his plan. Sarah and Alex were no longer people to him. They were pawns in a game of revenge, and Mark was the one pulling the strings. He knew that once Sarah was gone, once the final act was carried out, there would be no going back. But Mark didn't fear the consequences. He had already calculated them. He knew how the investigation would unfold. He knew exactly what to do to make sure Alex was the prime suspect. All it would take was a small mistake, a slip-up, a clue left behind, and Alex would be ruined. And Mark, the man who had been wronged, would be free. But it wasn't just about revenge. It was about showing everyone that Mark Mitchell was not a man to be crossed. He had been humiliated, betrayed, and now he would make sure that the world saw just how far he was willing to go to make those who wronged him pay. The day Alex Mitchell was arrested, the world as he knew it came crashing down. It was a quiet morning, the kind that felt like any other. He had been at home, minding his own business, when the knock at the door shattered the normalcy of the day. At first, Alex thought it was a misunderstanding. Maybe a mix-up with a package, or a neighbor who needed help with something trivial. But when he opened the door, the sight of two uniformed officers standing in his front yard told him this was no ordinary visit. "Alex Mitchell?" one of the officers asked, his voice stern, but not unkind. Alex nodded, unsure of what was happening. "Yeah, that's me. Can I help you?" "We need you to come with us," the officer said. "You're under arrest for the murder of Sarah Mitchell." For a moment, Alex stood frozen. The words didn't make sense. Murder, Sarah, his sister-in-law. He felt the blood drain from his face as his mind scrambled to process what was happening. "What are you talking about?" Alex stammered, taking a step back. "I didn't do anything. I didn't hurt her." But the officers didn't respond to his protests. They simply read him his rights and placed him in handcuffs. As they led him to the police car, the confusion inside him turned into a cold, gnawing fear. How could this be happening? How could he, a man who had barely spoken to Sarah in the weeks before her death, be accused of murdering her? The officers were tight-lipped, offering no explanations as they drove him to the station. But Alex's mind was already racing, trying to figure out how this could have gone so horribly wrong. He had been nothing but a bystander in his own life, watching the cracks in the Mitchell family grow wider and deeper with each passing day. But now he was being thrust into the center of a nightmare that made no sense. When they arrived at the police station, the interrogation began. Alex was led into a small room where two detectives sat waiting for him. Their faces were unreadable, but the tension in the air was palpable. They didn't waste any time. "Tell us where you were on the night of August 22nd, one of the detectives asked. His voice was flat, professional, but Alex could sense the underlying accusation. "I was at home," Alex replied, his voice shaking with disbelief. "I didn't even know Sarah was dead until you guys showed up here today." "What are you talking about?" The detectives exchanged a quick glance before turning their attention back to him. "We have evidence that places you at the scene," the other detective said, sliding a folder across the table. "Your fingerprints were found on a bottle of sleeping pills in Sarah's house. We also have a witness who saw you leaving her home the night of the murder." Alex's head spun. He tried to process the information, but it felt like his world was slipping further out of his control. He knew he hadn't been at Sarah's house that night. He hadn't even seen her in days. But the detectives were unrelenting, their questions sharp and insistent. Each answer he gave seemed to lead them down a new, darker path. They mentioned text messages, ones that Alex had never sent. They mentioned an argument between him and Sarah, one that had never taken place. The more they spoke, the more Alex began to feel as though the entire world was conspiring against him. Every piece of evidence, every accusation seemed designed to make him look guilty. But he hadn't done anything wrong. He was innocent. He couldn't understand how this was happening. As the hours wore on, Alex was subjected to more questioning, more scrutiny. His mind raced, trying to remember every detail of his movements from that night, every interaction he'd had with Sarah. But everything he recalled only seemed to deepen the mystery. There was nothing in his past that would explain why he'd be accused of murder. And yet, the case against him continued to grow stronger with each passing moment. Outside the interrogation room, Mark Mitchell watched through the one-way mirror. His face was impassive, but inside, a sense of satisfaction washed over him. He had orchestrated every detail of this moment, from the planted evidence to the fabricated witness statements. It was all going according to plan. Alex was on the verge of being convicted of a crime he hadn't committed, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. As Alex sat in that sterile interrogation room, he began to feel the weight of the world pressing down on him. He couldn't make sense of what was happening. He had no idea who was behind this, no idea who was pulling the strings. But what he did know was that his life had been turned upside down, and he was powerless to stop it. The officers continued their questioning, but Alex's mind wasn't on their words anymore. He was caught in a whirlwind of confusion and fear. His life was being torn apart, and he had no idea why. Little did he know, the true mastermind behind the plot was closer than he could ever have imagined. And the more Alex fought to prove his innocence, the deeper he would fall into a trap that he couldn't escape. As the investigation continued, small inconsistencies in Mark's story began to surface, details that didn't add up. At first, it seemed like he was a grieving husband, still in shock from the murder of his wife. But as detectives dug deeper, they found themselves questioning the very foundation of his narrative. The breakthrough came when the police examined the surveillance footage from around Oakwood Hills, an area known for its quiet streets, but also for its extensive network of cameras that tracked traffic and neighborhood activity. One of these cameras, near a convenience store, just a few blocks from Sarah's house, showed a car that matched Mark's vehicle, though it wasn't just the car that raised suspicion. The timestamp on the footage was crucial. It showed Mark's car passing by Sarah's house the night she died, several hours after the time he had initially claimed to have been at home, asleep. But there was more. Mark had told the police that he had been at a late-night meeting with a colleague, but no one had been able to corroborate his story. There were no records of the meeting, no phone calls, no emails, nothing. In fact, phone records showed that Mark had been in contact with Sarah's phone after midnight, the same night she was killed. He had claimed to have been sleeping during that time, but his phone's activity told a different story. It was a small, seemingly insignificant detail, but when put together with the other pieces, it was enough to raise doubts. Detectives also uncovered an oddity in the way the murder scene had been handled. The crime scene had been carefully staged. Everything about Sarah's death seemed too neat, too calculated, as if someone had meticulously planned it. The scene looked like a botched robbery gone wrong, but the police knew better than to take things at face value. As they pieced the evidence together, it became clear that someone had orchestrated this crime with a chilling precision, and that someone wasn't Alex. One of the most damning pieces of evidence came when a digital footprint was traced back to Mark. The digital trail, which had initially been overlooked, revealed a series of encrypted messages between him and an unknown number, messages that spoke of Sarah's unfaithfulness and how Mark intended to take control of the situation. The encrypted messages, hidden behind layers of code, were traced back to Mark's personal devices. They were clear proof that Mark had been planning his revenge long before Sarah's death. Detectives also managed to find traces of the sleeping pills, an important part of the murder plan, on Mark's personal belongings. The pills had been purchased under his name from a local pharmacy a week before Sarah's death. This was another detail Mark had failed to explain. As all the pieces fell into place, the detectives confronted Mark with the mounting evidence. Initially, he remained calm, as if trying to maintain the illusion of a man caught in a tragedy. But with each revelation, his facade began to crack. The calm exterior he had so carefully constructed began to fracture as the detectives pressed him further, revealing the depth of his manipulation. "It's over, Mark," one of the detectives said, the weariness of weeks of investigation finally evident in his voice. "We know what you did. You planned it all. Sarah's death, the framing of Alex. It's all right here." Mark's shoulders slumped, the weight of the truth finally settling in. His face grew pale as he realized the extent of his actions had been exposed. He had meticulously plotted Sarah's murder and the framing of Alex, but in the end, his overconfidence had led to his downfall. The detectives informed Mark that the evidence they had gathered was more than enough to charge him with first-degree murder. His attempts to manipulate the investigation, to frame his brother, had all been for nothing. The truth was now undeniable. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," Mark muttered under his breath, but his words were weak, as if he were trying to justify the cold, calculated murder he had committed. In the weeks that followed, the investigation and Mark's confession were all over the news. The shocking revelation of a husband plotting the death of his wife with such meticulous cruelty left the community reeling. Mark had used his brother, Alex, as a pawn in his twisted scheme, manipulating the evidence and setting him up to take the fall. But in the end, it was his own pride and carelessness that led to his undoing. Alex was exonerated, but the damage had already been done. He was left with the scars of being accused of a crime he didn't commit, a man torn apart by the betrayal of his own brother. The road to healing would be long for Alex, and though he was free, the weight of the years lost in a nightmare would never truly leave him. Mark Mitchell was arrested and charged with murder, his betrayal of his family sealed in a courtroom. The once proud lawyer had become a cautionary tale, a man consumed by jealousy, rage, and a desire for control that would cost him everything. For Oakwood Hills, the quiet neighborhood that had once seemed so peaceful, the truth had finally emerged, shattering the illusion of perfection that had masked the dark secrets lurking beneath the surface. The trial of Mark Mitchell was one of the most highly publicized cases Oakwood Hills had ever witnessed. As the courtroom buzzed with anticipation, the tension in the air was palpable. Mark, once a respected lawyer, now sat in the defendant's chair, his face pale and his eyes hollow. The very community that had once admired him now looked upon him with disdain, as the full extent of his cold and calculated actions came to light. The prosecution presented a damning case. Mark's meticulous planning, the falsified evidence, his betrayal of his own brother, and his role in the murder of his wife, Sarah. They painted a picture of a man consumed by greed and rage, willing to destroy everything he had to exact revenge. They showed the jury the digital footprints, the surveillance footage, and the encrypted messages, proof that Mark had planned Sarah's death in chilling detail. Mark's defense tried to argue that his actions had been fueled by emotional distress, the result of a broken marriage and a moment of temporary insanity. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before reaching a unanimous verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. As the judge pronounced the sentence, the weight of Mark's actions seemed to crush the room. He was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. His life, once filled with success and admiration, was now reduced to the grim reality of a prison cell. Mark's downfall was swift and unforgiving, the culmination of his own hubris and deceit. While Mark's fate was sealed, the aftermath of his actions left deep scars, especially for Alex. Although Alex had been exonerated and his name cleared, the damage to his life was irreparable. The years he had spent in a nightmare, wrongly accused of a crime he did not commit, had left him broken. His relationship with Sarah was forever tarnished, his trust in family shattered beyond repair. The bond he had shared with Mark, once his closest ally, had been destroyed by betrayal. Alex tried to rebuild his life, but the road ahead was long. He moved away from Oakwood Hills, seeking a fresh start, but the shadow of the past continued to follow him. He would never forget the pain of being framed by his own brother, the emotional toll it had taken on him, and the years lost in a fight for his innocence. In the end, justice had been served, but it came at a devastating cost. Mark Mitchell's actions had destroyed not only his own life, but also the lives of those closest to him. And for Alex, the scars of betrayal would remain, a constant reminder of the price of a family's shattered trust.